very excited to talk with you this morning about this passage. We are continuing on our lectionary journey. This passage is from Romans 12, 9 through 21. You can follow along if you would like. I know Romans, right? Yeah, we're going to dive in. You can just listen and receive. It's good, guys, I promise. Let love be sincere. Abhor what is evil. Cling to what is good. Love one another as family. Lead the way in showing honor to one another. In zeal, not idle. Fervent in spirit, serving the Messiah. In hope, rejoice. In suffering, endure. In prayer, persevere. Take part in meeting the needs of the saints. Practice hospitality. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse them. Rejoice with those who rejoice, and weep with those who weep. Live in harmony with one another. Do not think highly of yourself. Sit with the lowly. Do not claim to be wiser than you are. Do not repay anyone evil for evil, but contemplate what is good in the sight of all persons. If possible, for you, live peaceably with all. Do not avenge yourselves, beloved. Rather, leave room for the wrath of God. For it is written, "Vengeance is mine. I will repay," says the Holy One. On the contrary, if your enemies hunger, feed them. If they thirst, give them drink. For by doing this, you will heap burning coals on their heads. Be not overcome by evil, rather overcome evil with good. The word of the Lord. If there is one phrase that will really get me riled up, it's 3 words. It's the phrase, "That won't work." You can ask Bud. Anytime someone says, "That won't work," fire is coming out of my body. If I say, "Every person deserves a roof over their head, so let's make housing affordable or maybe even free," that won't work. Healthcare is a human right, so let's create universal healthcare. That won't work. Every person deserves rest, so let's take down the competitive capitalistic system that forces folks to find their worth in how many hours they work. Well, that won't work. Men and women are created equal, so let's put more women in positions of power and influence, or maybe forego the patriarchal system altogether for something different. That won't work. It's as if, what really gets me going, people are so stuck in the scarcity mindset of the way it always has been that there's no imagination for a future of flourishing. I hear "that won't work," and I want to respond with, "But could we at least try? What does it cost to actually use our imaginations for a better world?" I think it's really easy to hear this passage I just read and think the same thing. That won't work. A community that is leading the way in honoring one another instead of grasping for power over one another, that won't work. A community that simply sits with people in grief instead of offering platitudes or explanations, that won't work. A community that is loving our enemies and blessing them instead of seeking retribution, that won't work. This passage could be read as one giant "that won't work," and I get it, because I don't see a lot of leading the way in honoring in our society. I don't see a lot of blessing of our enemies. Instead, I see a lot of power grabbing and a lot of retribution. In fact, if I'm honest, in the not too distant past, I would have read this passage and thought, that won't work. And here's why. I have harmed people. My words and actions have wounded others. I have been someone's enemy. And I have been harmed by people inside the church. I've been in meetings where my beliefs were interrogated and my sermons were ripped to shreds. I've been accused of not living up to someone else's standard of holiness. I've been deemed unsafe and dangerous. I've been accused of leading people away from Christ. I have been called, one that I wear with a badge of honor, Jezebel. And worst, maybe, heretic, though I won't go so far as to tattoo it on my arm. I understand what it means to have enemies. And confessing that is really hard because if you guys know me at all, my whole mantra, if I had to reduce the gospel message to like one phrase, like what I preach on the regular, is that every person is good. At their core, they are image bearers of God. It's not the people who are evil. It is the systems that we're complicit in. Every person is good. It's the evil systems. Yes, this is my message. Everyone is good at their core. But when the rubber hits the road, when real life happens, when I come into contact with people who say and do harmful things, and when I do and say harmful things, people feel like enemies. Real people, real enemies. People whose image I cannot find one kernel of goodness. So to really think about leading in the way of honor, to really think about what it costs to love our enemies, yeah, that's not going to work. But what I've come to discover, and what I'm still learning, is that a lot of the pain and harm that we cause and that is inflicted upon us comes out of fear. Fear of losing our sense of power and control. Fear that we will not see retribution. Fear that God doesn't care, and maybe even more so, that fear that God has abandoned us. This passage cuts to the heart of what it means to live in community. It isn't all sunshine and rainbows. It's hard work. It's messy. Our wounds inevitably rub up against each other's wounds, and it hurts. And we have a choice, an invitation from Paul to leave. We have an invitation either to, we have a choice. We leave. Too hard, too painful. I'm not going to dig in. Or to stay. To allow ourselves to be transformed by the pain that's been inflicted upon us, or the pain that we have inflicted on others. Because here's the cool thing. When this passage came up on the lectionary and I read it 2 weeks ago, I didn't think that can't work. I read it and said, this is possible. I've seen it happen. That shift has not come as a result of anything I've done on my own. It's grown alongside community. I have a spiritual director. I have a therapist. Thank the Lord. I have a husband. I have kids. I have my family. And every single person sitting in this room. When I read this passage, I think this is our community. This is who we are, and maybe more so like who we're moving towards becoming, because we have not arrived yet. This way of living in community does not come without pain or discomfort, unfortunately. It doesn't come without confronting our fears. It doesn't come without trust in God to not abandon us, and trust in our community to help form and transform us. Richard Rohr has said that transformation happens through suffering. And I experience that statement to be true. And as hard as it is to hear, transformation happens with suffering. It comes at a cost. Because you guys, I'm all about the first half of this passage. I'm all about it. Loving, yes. Honoring one another, yes. Rejoicing, even grieving, sitting with each other, showing hospitality, even humbling ourselves. Yes, resonates. Yes, yes, yes. And then Paul takes what I would consider an about face. And he says, don't repay evil with evil. He says, bless those who persecute you. He says, love your enemies. Feed them if they're hungry. Meet their needs too. And then he talks about God's wrath, which makes me really uncomfortable. So we have this idea of discomfort at the end of this passage. And I just want to be like, let's just move that out of let's get our little white out. That's not what this says. Because to admit that I even have enemies takes courage. But then to require to love them, I'm out. It's impossible. Because what if those people don't see retribution? What if they're not held accountable for the pain that they've caused? And what if they are, but it doesn't look the way that I want it to look? Paul's invitation is to allow what evil has been done to us transform us. Paul's invitation is to trust God's ultimate judgment, to trust God's wrath against injustice. But I don't like talking about God's wrath against myself. I love talking about God's wrath against my enemies. But God only loves me, right? It's only sunshine and rainbows for me. But those people, wrath. Love for me. But I think what's happening here is that we make love and wrath two different things, that they're separated. But a Black theologian named James Cone has something to say about that. He says, the wrath of God is the love of God in regard to the forces against his liberation of the oppressed. So if there are forces blocking liberation, you better bet God's wrath is there. Whether that's collective liberation or liberation within ourselves. There are things within us that keep us bound. Bitterness, hate, fear. It binds us, and you better believe God's wrath is coming for that because it's blocking our liberation. You better believe that God is coming for injustice. So Paul is inviting us to trust that God is love. And that if God is love, that means that God will use wrath to fight for our liberation. God's wrath is actually, paradoxically, love. So yes, God's love can make us feel all kinds of discomfort. And we fear that discomfort because it feels like a loss of control. It's painful. But that undoing is what puts us back together. God's love is the power that raises the valleys and also lowers the mountains. You better believe that lowering of the mountains is painful. But what it does is it brings equity. It brings justice. And it comes as a result of wrath. We got to be angry about the injustice. This is the paradox that cuts right to the heart of the gospel. And that is being split open is making us whole. And to experience true community, sincere love, to experience actual belonging, it is messy and uncomfortable, and we'll bump up against each other. There will be tension. Iron, if we allow it, will sharpen iron. This experience of love and belonging in community reminds us also that this transformation happens beyond ourselves. My mind didn't change. My actions didn't change. I didn't transform as a result of what I did within myself. I did it as a result of the people around me revealing what it means to live in community, to love better, to honor others. So if we choose to stay committed to each other, if we choose to trust each other and to trust in God's love, then our community will be transformed. And it will be one that embodies God's kingdom. Like, it is actually possible. It can work. It can work. As I was preparing for this, I was reading an interpretation of this passage from this book, Romans Disarmed. I have not read the whole thing, but the section that I read was really good, so I recommend it. It's from our library. Shameless plug. But what the authors do here is reframe this passage in a way that, well, it's a new way of thinking about it, but it also is framed in what would be relevant for us today and a challenge for us today. So it's a little bit long, bear with me, but I think it's worth reading the whole thing. Let's begin by getting beyond a pious sentimentality of love. If love is genuine, if love is really willing to go the distance for the beloved, if love is to be more than a secondhand emotion, then to deeply love, we must learn how to hate what is evil. That means that love requires the naming of names. Love does not play nice. There's too much at stake for that. If we are to love in a time of hate, then we need to paradoxically hate that hate and name it for what it is. If we are going to love women, we must hate misogyny. If we're going to love our Muslim neighbors, we must hate Islamophobia. If we're going to love the indigenous peoples of this land, we must hate colonialism and its persistent wound and the way that we remain the beneficiaries of a colonial system. If we're going to love our LGBTQ siblings, we must hate homophobia and transphobia. If we're going to love those of different ethnicities than our own, we must hate racism. If we're going to love the voices of our neighbors, we must hate systems that disenfranchise voters. If we're going to love generosity and equality, we must hate economic structures that willingly sacrifice the poor and a caste system that enriches the very few at the expense of the very many. If we're going to love those who suffer displacement and injustice, then we must hate the geopolitical and economic military forces that render whole peoples homeless and refugees. If we're going to love kindness, then we must hate forces of violence and torture, whether they are ISIS, CSIS, or the CIA. If we love our creational home, then we must hate ways of living that cause its rape and destruction. You see, my friends, if love is genuine, then we must hate what is evil and hold fast to what is good. To do that, we will need to be diligent in discerning the good. That's why we need prophets and teachers in our midst. But it isn't really all that complicated. Counter-imperial love hates what is evil and holds fast to what is good by loving one another in mutual affection and outdoing one another in showing honor. The love that is manifest in the body is a profound antidote to the discord and hatred that has taken a demonic hold on our culture. And while the competitiveness of a capitalist culture amounts to little more than a war of all against all, including a war on the very creational foundations of life, we are called to a competition that subverts its culture. While everything around us calls us to honor those who are most powerful, to pay homage to the honorable member from such and such, his worship, the mayor, or your worship, the judge in court, and certainly to give honor to those who hold the highest positions of state, especially when they come down golden escalators, the body of Christ sees all of this as nonsense. The body of Christ is all about outdoing one another and showing honor, especially to those who are most dishonored in society. Associate with the lowly. Walk with the oppressed. Give preference to the voices of the poor. Replace exploitation with affection. While the forces around you will bear you down and tell you in so many ways that resistance is futile, do not lag in zeal. Don't give in. Hold each other up. Be a community of spiritual vitality against the odds. You will need to exercise the gift of encouragement as if your life depends on it, because your life does depend on it. Yes, I know that this is a path of suffering. This isn't the easy way in these times. But Jesus did call us to a cross, didn't he? So remember who is your Lord. Remember the path that he took. Let the hope of his resurrection, the hope of his coming kingdom sustain you. God has given you leaders who will show you the way. And let this hope facing this suffering animate your prayers. Never give up praying, friends. Without prayer, we're done for. Remember generosity. Care for the needs of the community. Don't stop there. Extend hospitality to strangers as well. If the powers that be will replace the open hand with a closed fist raised in a salute, then you must be an open-handed people, not only to those in your community, but also to those outside, providing homes to those whose families have kicked them out, offering hospitality to those who have no community, sanctuary for those who fear deportation, welcome for those who would be banned, refuge for those who are targeted and profiled. That's just a little piece. But I think it hits home both the cost and the desire that we have for living in true community. May it be so.